Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. We return today to our ongoing conversation about place, and how place forms a foundation for our pursuit of biblical justice. One of the most important places that defines our understanding is where we live. These particular places shape and form us, and in some cases can offer opportunities we couldn't get anywhere else. I think in the United States, we experience a narrative that these opportunities are available to anyone, assuming you have the means to move into the neighborhood. But what if decisions made throughout our history ensured that some demographic groups, in large part, still wouldn't be able to move in? For centuries, American housing policy was specifically designed to keep Black and brown people out of certain areas. Practices like redlining and racial housing covenants, which excluded these groups 100 years ago, have resulted in those same neighborhoods remaining majority white today. There is a story to be told, with data to back it up, about why our neighborhoods look the way they do today. And one of the people who has led the effort to map this data is today's guest, Dr. Kirsten Delegard. Dr. Delegard is a public historian and one of the co-founders of the award-winning Mapping Prejudice project. Her team has worked with more than 15,000 volunteers to identify and map racial covenants, which barred people who were not white from buying or occupying land. Mapping Prejudice seeks to empower community changemakers to translate awareness about these racist property deeds into reparative work. Dr. Delegard is a graduate of the Minneapolis Public Schools, Wesleyan University, and holds a PhD in history from Duke University. My introduction to Mapping Prejudice and Dr. Delegard's work came more than 6 years ago through the documentary Jim Crow of the North. And since the beginning of the podcast, this is a conversation I've hoped to have here. Racial housing covenants have legs that have carried their impact around our country for decades. And today you'll learn how they both differ from and complement the practice of redlining, how they affected investment into neighborhoods, and why the specifically racial and racist nature of these documents matters to us today. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Dr. Kirsten Delegard. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Dr. Delegard, thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me.
This is the first time that there is someone on the podcast who is not from a specifically, explicitly Christian institution. So this is our first foray into expanding our academic understanding in other ways, I guess you could say.
I feel honored. Thank you for inviting me into the conversation.
And I think a big reason, beyond just being familiar with the work of Mapping Prejudice through some different things that we'll get to, we've been focusing on place and how place shapes our understanding of justice. And I think something that a lot of people may not realize is that the places we live are largely influenced by decisions that were made at this point now, like 100 years ago and even more. Yeah. I wonder if you can kind of talk a little bit about introducing what some of those decisions were in the context of your work.
Gosh, that is a huge question, and you just sent my brain spinning. I'll just be frank that we didn't actually talk through the questions before, which is good in terms of conversation. So I'll talk specifically about the sort of the fulcrum of the Mapping Prejudice project. So we are a group of public historians and librarians And we excavate stories and document the existence of things called racial covenants. And racial covenants were clauses that were inserted into property deeds that explicit legally prohibited certain pieces of land from being occupied or owned by people who are not white. So I think what most people don't realize is that racial covenants were there are thousands and thousands of them in the property records in just the Twin Cities of Minnesota. But these racial covenants were put into the property records of every community across the United States, and actually in a lot of large parts of Canada as well. So there's no community that you might be living in, no place that you might be living in, where there weren't explicitly racist prohibitions put into the land records to basically to reserve certain parts of communities just for white people. And this is not just a antiquarian sort of oddity, something that's in the past. It's something that affects every part of the cities or the communities that we're living in today. So I live in South Minneapolis. I live in a beautiful part of South Minneapolis. My house today does not have a racial covenant on it, but the blocks near my house do have racial covenants on them, which meant that for a lot of the 20th century, this part of the city was you had to be white to live here. And that didn't just determine just the racial composition of the neighborhoods or my street or my block. It determined what kind of resources were pumped into this community, like how much investment was put into our local parks, what kind of school facilities were made available in the neighborhood, where when the freeways were built, where were they put into place? Were they they're further from my house. They didn't destroy my house, which was built in 1922. So all of these things, we study one sort of legal instrument that was widely used in the United States in the early 20th century, but that legal instrument sort of created shaped the landscape in a way that we've been building on ever since. So whether it's determining where people can get loans for their mortgage loans for their houses, where there's been investment over many decades into our public amenities like parks, where there's been investments into schools. So that's perhaps a long answer to your short question, but once you get me started, you can tell that I will say a lot. So
yeah, and it's a good answer. It's a good place for us to begin, I think. And I think it's good to introduce the idea of housing covenants, not just because of that's what the conversation is going to be about today and what your work is based on, but I think because maybe at like a popular level, maybe colloquially, people who are familiar kind of with housing policy from the past might be more familiar with a term like redlining than they are with housing covenants. What is the difference between redlining and a racial housing covenant?
Right. I'm so glad that you brought that up because people often come to us and say, "Oh, you're the redlining project, right?" And we say, "Well, we study something that's definitely very close to, that's very integrated, very very connected to redlining, but it's not redlining." So racial covenants were, private legal. There were clauses that were inserted into property records, and they were actually used. Some other researchers in other parts of the country have found them even early in the 19th century. They became really popular in all American cities in the late 19th and early 20th century. And they were really extremely widespread here in the Twin Cities in the 1920s. They changed the urban landscape. They segregated what had previously been not a segregated city. They pushed Black people into certain neighborhoods. Then in the 1930s, when the global economy collapsed, and especially people started, there were mass foreclosures, people were losing their housing. one of the things the federal government decided to do was to make massive investments to support home ownership. And so they started putting aside big pots of money to support home lending, right? But as they were creating those policies, those programs, they had to determine, okay, where are we going to lend money? What kind of neighborhoods are we going to lend money in? Who are we going to give the money to? So one of the things that they did is they commissioned real estate professionals and appraisers all over the country to go out into communities and to map the areas that were safe investments and the areas that were not safe investments. And one of the criteria that they used was, were there racial covenants in place in those communities? So if a community had a racial covenant, it got a high rating. If it didn't have any racial covenants, and if there were a lot of people of different races, among other factors, living in a community, it was redlined. So racial covenants are like the foundation that redlining was built on. But racial covenants came first, and then redlining sort of compounded the harm that was done by racial covenants, because the redlining process, the redlining maps, said, if you don't have a racial covenant, your neighborhood and your home is worth less. And that had all kinds of cascading intergenerational implications, because it meant that people couldn't get mortgages to buy a house in an area that didn't have racial restrictions on it. It meant that since it was harder to get a mortgage in a house in that neighborhood, in the neighborhoods that were redlined, property values were depressed. And so on and so forth. And so even though redlining has, long been illegal, now today people talk about redlining. They use it as sort of a shorthand to describe a whole constellation of discriminatory policies, whether it's real estate steering, sometimes racial covenants, just in general policies that support racial segregation and also devalue neighborhoods where people who are not white can live or have lived historically.
Yeah, that is an interesting, just from a timeline perspective, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize it was as early as you just said it was that these started showing up. Part of that, I think, is because living in the Twin Cities, we just didn't exist that early.
Yeah, right.
And so I think the 1910s, 19 teens into the 20s is when that explosion of presence started to show up here. Yep. And then just quickly on the redlining, the term itself, for people who are unfamiliar, that refers to the colors that were used. They were like color-coded maps, and red was the worst.
Right.
The do not invest, I guess, sort of a...
Yes. Yeah, thank you for thank you for that. Yeah, so these are very visually compelling maps, right? So they're red, green, yellow, and blue. And the different colors indicate, is it a high value neighborhood? Is it a place that's really safe for investors? Or is it a hazardous neighborhood? And so if it was red, it was considered hazardous. And if it was blue or green, that was a place that it was considered safe for investment.
Yeah. And then in my opinion, just looking at the maps, you can kind of see, in my words, how ridiculous the distinctions are, because just of the shapes of where things are drawn. So in Minneapolis in particular, if you look at a redlining map, there's just like this strip down 4th Avenue on the south side, which was like this like black business corridor at the time. Right. 3 blocks on either side of it, it can be blue and green.
Right.
And so it just like doesn't make sense other than a very specific sort of targeting.
Well, and if you want more additional proof of the logic that's used to make those decisions, read the descriptions, the area descriptions. So if you look at you can go to Mapping Inequality, which is this website that has digitized all the redlining maps for communities across the country, and you can click on the different on the different neighborhoods, or like the red areas or the blue areas in different cities, and it will say why they ranked it in such a way. And so in Minneapolis and St. Paul, race is almost not 100% of the time, but it's almost always mentioned. The racial characteristics of the people who live there is considered a major factor in whether it's a safe for investment neighborhood or a hazardous neighborhood.
Yeah. This might be a good time to bring in what some of these covenants actually say. So
Mm,
you had encouraged me to look through. I've looked at the Mapping Prejudice website, which has some of those digitized records available for you to see on
yeah.
each of those places that have covenants.
Yeah.
And you encouraged me to go to some different places, either where I lived or near where I lived. I will
Yeah.
attempt to not dox myself and give away too much of my personal information, but
Yeah.
we'll share a couple of these here. So the first place I lived when I moved into Minneapolis proper was on in South Minneapolis, and there was a
Hmm.
house three houses up the street basically that had
Hmm.
a covenant on it. So,
Hmm.
and it was placed in 1941, and it says the parties of the second party, so presumably the buyers,
Hmm.
hereby covenant and agree that the above described premises shall not now nor at any future time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of a colored race.
Wow.
So that's one. What we can see in some different places too. I pulled three of them. One near where I grew up in the suburbs adds on some language that talks about, like, specifically identifies Caucasian race,
Mm.
but then also says, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by persons of other races in domestic service upon such premises.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, if you have, say, a maid living in and working for you in your home, that
Yeah.
person is allowed, but you couldn't sell or rent to that person if they weren't performing those tasks.
Yeah. As long as they're there to serve white people. White
Yeah.
people have to be the ones who occupy the land, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then the third one here, I don't remember specifically where I pulled this from, but is more explicit about who is not allowed to purchase.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
shall not be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro,
Hmm.
Mongolian, or African blood or descent.
Yeah.
And that one's from the 1920s, 1925.
So we
So they're
call that
not
last.
hiding.
No, no, and I think that's what's so powerful, and really chilling, frankly. So that last one that you read, we call that sort of the OG covenant. Is that's the text of the first covenant that was put into place in 1910 by a man named Edmund Walton. And it does have that laundry list of like who's not allowed. And it is really, I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about like what is who did he mean by Mongolian? Were there a lot of Mongolians living? Our modern conception of who Mongolians are. Were there a lot of Turkish people living in Minneapolis? Thought it was a big threat. Um, but you see this change over time from that early, we call it the laundry list of the laundry list covenants, to the second one you read, which was only white people can live here, but they can share the space as long as the person is with a person who's not white, as long as that person is there to be a servant. So again, like it's super explicit. And I would say the whole inspiration for Mapping Prejudice for me what comes out of my experience being a teacher. And when I have taught history, for me, the my students have the most powerful learning when they actually go back when I share like a primary historical text with them, and they go back to the original text and read it and decode it and see what it means. And so my vision for this project was that I wanted people in my hometown of Minneapolis. I was born and raised in Minneapolis. I wanted everybody in this community to have that experience that you just had, which was reading this text and ruminating on what does this mean for me? Like, if this was attached to the house I grew up in, what does that mean? What does that tell me about my neighborhood? Who had access to this neighborhood? And what does it tell me about why my neighborhood looks the way it does today? Because we know that people live in houses for a very long time, usually. I mean, that it's when you buy a house, it's a long-term commitment. So it's not uncommon for people to live in a house for 30 years, right? And to sometimes to pass that house down to someone in their family. So these are documents, these kind of racist restrictions have a long tail. They're deeply racist, deeply disturbing, and really powerful.
Yeah. And I think I kind of want to talk about some of why this is important today,
Yeah.
why the way our neighborhoods look is important. The first thing that we've
Hmm.
already discussed, I think, is economically the sort of investment that has come into these neighborhoods
Hmm.
over the last
Yeah.
100 years. Again, so
Yep.
the redlining maps were drawn in the mid 1930s, so we're at the 90-year mark or so. But
Hmm.
I wonder if you have any sort of have done any historical work on what that looks like, because what it makes me think about is that right now, so I live on Minneapolis's north side, which is
Hmm.
historically kind of the more underfunded, more
Hmm.
diverse. We've had
Yep.
some conversations on the podcast already about what North Minneapolis looks like. And even
Yep.
today, there's a big push right now. The North Side Forward program is trying to bring in a whole lot of money to invest in the North
Hmm.
Side. But they've said that money that comes into the north side is more likely to come in through nonprofits and grants than through
Hmm.
banks and loans and business
Hmm.
investments, because
Yeah.
it's still viewed as this risky investment because
Hmm.
of the makeup of the neighborhood.
Mm.
So we have this long history of this still being the case. Do you have you done work to see what other sorts of investments typically went into certain neighborhoods and not into other
Hmm.
neighborhoods?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, this is a really, really important question. So the most tangible thing that we have found, and I say we, everything that Mapping Prejudice does, we do in coalition with other folks. So we collaborate all the time with people from different disciplines in the academic world, and then people from every walk of life, whether it's local city officials, faith leaders, housing activists. So one of the collaborations that we did was with a team of economists who took our data to and put it into conversation with modern housing prices. And what they revealed is that in 2019, a house that had a racial covenant at any point in its time in its history, and again, this is more than 50 years after these are illegal everywhere in the country, even longer in Minnesota. Um, uh, that those houses that had a racial covenant in Minneapolis were worth 15% more than identical houses that had never had a racial covenant. And this is when they controlled for everything like number of bathrooms, the age of the house, the proximity to a park, all the things that normally go into a real estate appraisal process. So to me that, and to the economists too, this was met with wide skepticism, I will say, among other economists. They're like, how is that possible? How is that possible? That's not possible. But the reality is that racial covenants operated as like financial magnets. So when racial covenants were in place, it was a signal to everybody that this was a place where you could put your money and it would grow and be kept safe. So it's everything from business investment, which of course creates more amenities for the people who live close to those businesses, to parks and to schools, right? And so I think I'm going to muddle this a bit. So please, I'm going to say it in a very general way, and then you'll get people who listen and they say you got it, you got the details wrong, and that's critical. But there's something about the taxation system in the city of Minneapolis that if homes in a certain neighborhood were valued higher then the parks that were close to those homes also got more investment. Like it was like it's a little like property taxes in schools in certain communities. That if you have a wealthy community, there's going to be more revenue that comes in through property taxes that then can be used to support schools. So all of what the values of properties in a neighborhood do is that they create, it's a snowball effect, right? They create more amenities, which then in turn raise the prices of the homes. So it's this virtuous or unfair cycle, depending on where you sit in or out of it. But that's one of the things the economists have speculated happened is that once a racial covenant was in place, there was all this other investment in the neighborhood, which then continued to make houses appreciate more quickly.
Yeah, and it's probably worth noting that uh, there are some places where covenants were one-off or more one-off esque.
Right.
So, like that
Yeah.
first neighborhood I lived in Minneapolis, there was
Right.
one covenanted house on the block, and maybe
Yep.
within a couple block radius. But for the most part, it was like full housing developments that had these written into
Yes.
property deeds even before
Yes.
houses were built.
Right.
So there's something about, we even think today about property values being affected by what's around us. It sounds like
Mhm.
that's a similar sort of compounding thing of
Yeah. Of
it's
course.
neighborhoods with
Yeah.
housing covenants on them that a larger group of people are moving in, not just one individual family.
Yeah. Right. I mean, obviously people are making choices to put these covenants in place, but this is really structural. This is beyond the choice of one person. And also another thing that researchers have found over the years, not here with our data in Minnesota, but in other places, is that they call it a halo effect around a covenant. So even if there's just say half a block has racial covenants on it, it basically functions as though the whole area has racial covenants because it sends out social signals to people too about like who's welcome there and who's not welcome there. How and depending on how you think about that, people translated that into the stability of the neighborhood or how worthy it was of investment.
Yeah. I can't help but think about that with a particular story from Minneapolis's history of the
Mhm.
Arthur and Edith Lee family in their
Yeah.
home in South
Yeah.
Minneapolis, which was not specifically. So the story for people who are unfamiliar is that it's a World War I veteran and his family, Arthur and Edith Lee. It's a black family moving into a South Minneapolis neighborhood that did not have covenants on. I think there were covenants on houses nearby, but not actually in their neighborhood.
Correct. Yeah.
But it was a place where essentially is understood black people are not welcome to live in this neighborhood. It is
Mhm.
a sort of
Mhm.
self-segregated type of a situation, to
Yep.
the point where when the family moves in, there is strong, like large, violent resistance to the family living there. And so I think that,
6,000 people. Yeah.
yeah, thousands of people surrounding their house
Yep.
every night for a while, a month, if not months on end.
Hmm. Yeah.
So that I think
Yeah.
speaks to that
Yeah.
halo effect of, even though it was not specifically in a covenanted neighborhood, it was this is who is welcome and this is who is not, even if it is not explicitly stated.
It also shows just one thing that we have found is that when we look at our map, there's some places on the map where we're like, wow, I would have expected to find covenants here, and we don't. But as we've looked through newspaper sources in particular, or through other kind of archival documents, we found that there's a lot of incidents of racial violence in those neighborhoods. And so that's one thing that we always try to emphasize that covenants work in concert with racial violence, so that the Lees moved to a little house on the corner of 46th and Clinton in South Minneapolis, and you can actually visit the site, the house. There's a marker outside that the neighborhood has now put up to memorialize this really terrible incident. But the Lees had been living further north in the Old South Side, and it was 1931. Arthur had a steady job at the post office. They wanted to invest in a house, have more stability. They had a 5-year-old daughter who was about to start kindergarten. And so they found this tiny little white bungalow, but it was located just a couple blocks out of what the people in the neighborhood perceived to be the outside of the bounds of where Black people were supposed to live, right? And so they organized this violent mob during the summer of 1931, where thousands and thousands of people, literally at sometimes 6,000 people, would show up every night to terrorize the Lees and try to get them to move. And the Lees actually had to sleep in the basement of their house because people kept shooting through the windows and throwing rocks through the windows. And they really wanted, I mean, and they did, they really fought to stay in their home because they felt like if they left, there would be no hope for anyone coming. You know, it was a matter of principle for them, for their family, but also for other Black people who were hoping to buy homes and live where they wanted to live in South Minneapolis. So yeah, so that's a really important story, I think, for us to reflect on as Minneapolitans and think about, what would we do if we
Yeah.
knew that was happening today?
And that's of the many interesting pieces of that story. One of them is that they did not move until they felt they had showed you did not force us out of here.
Right. Yeah.
So it was 3 or so years later that they ended up moving out of the house. But
And I mean, they were able to stay because they had support. They had social support. They had support from Arthur's coworkers at the post office who actually formed an armed perimeter around the house. Other military veterans showed up to help them. People in the NAACP. The president of the NAACP was a woman named Lena Olive Smith. She was the first Black woman to pass the bar in the state of Minnesota. And she fought fiercely for them because there were other people who were urging them, like, why are you making trouble? Why don't you just move out? Like, we'll find you another place to live. But she really was adamant that she had their back and that she was going to fight for their right to stay in their home.
yeah. Another thing that comes to mind when we think about not just economic investment as a reason for the importance of this conversation,
Mm-hmm.
but just in general, living in a diverse community. Do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts about why it is important, or is there importance of living in a diverse community?
It's incredibly important. I mean, on every level, right? As humans, as to have strong communities. I mean, I just will say, uh, so I grew up in Minneapolis. I graduated from high school and then I left to go to college and lived in different parts of the world. And I returned 20 years later with my 2 little kids and my husband. And when we were looking to find a place to live and a place for her to enroll in kindergarten, I was really dismayed to see that that my choices were either an all white school, or, that was the predominant choice, or a school where she might be the only white child. And I just felt like that was not healthy. That did not prepare. That was not good preparation for the world that we all want to live in. But those like the school segregation that we faced was really a function of the spatial segregation of our communities. But it was so anyway. So I'm telling that story of like. It was very extremely distressing to me that there was really only one elementary school in Minneapolis at the time that really reflected the economic and racial richness of the city, and that was Whittier Elementary School, and that's where my kids ended up going. And my kids were there. Let's see. Collectively, the 2 of them for at least a decade. So I had at least a decade where I was in this incredibly rich diverse community of parents and kids and teachers. And my kids are now in their 20s, But they both say that this was their favorite school that they've ever gone to, that they learned the most. And it was not just, the learning to read and write and, do math and all that. But it was just, they had these incredible experiences with kids who had such different backgrounds. There were kids who were newly resettled refugees, that we had a really large Somali community, really large Latino community. My son is totally fluent in Spanish because he had that grounding of hearing Spanish all the time and being immersed in multiple languages when he was young. And both of them are just so comfortable moving through the world and exploring new places and connecting with people. And I just really credit those early years that they had. I wish that the block that I live on actually has a lot of apartment buildings, which I like, because it means that it is people at different stages of life, people from different backgrounds. It's not just all single family homes. But I just wish in Minneapolis in particular that we had more neighborhoods where that were truly integrated in terms of economically, racially, religiously. Because I just think this is the world that we live in, and we're so much stronger if we can figure out our points of connection, if we can figure out our shared humanity with one another, if we can build on our complementary strengths. And this might sound like just pie in the sky idealism, but it is just practical. Like we live in a global world, right? And it's been really cool to me to see the way my kids have translated their elementary school years into their actually like grown-up careers, of being able to walk into just a wide variety of social settings, a wide variety of professional settings, and really feel comfortable and be able to connect with people. I mean, we're in this moment in the United States, and I would say the world, of just horrendous inequality and polarization. So we need, more desperately than ever, we need people who can bridge those divides. And I think we're only going to be able to cultivate those skills if we are living and communicating and figuring out how to do things together with people from a wide variety of backgrounds. Plus, it's just so much more interesting. The food is much better if you live in a more, I grew up in a Swedish Lutheran family. It's like, I don't think most people want to eat like Swedish Lutheran church food all the time. So it's much better to have access to Somali food and Ethiopian food and, great tacos. And, I'm making light, but it's truly like the thing that makes life interesting and fun and beautiful.
Yeah. There are a lot of reasons I like that answer, but one of them is because the episode that is going to come just before this one, we kind of talk about that. What does it look like to bridge the gap, and talk about cultural intelligence? So it's going to flow very naturally. So thank you for that narratively. Other than that, I can't help but note that we've talked a lot about the city of Minneapolis. I think very much talked about an urban setting. Yeah. But this is not exclusively an urban reality, talking about racial housing covenants. What does this look like? Maybe we can think first about the suburbs. What is suburban life, suburban areas? What have you drawn from the research that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. There are actually more covenants in the suburbs than there are in the city. I mean, but it depends on chronology, right? So it's the first ring suburbs. So racial covenants were put into place in Minnesota between about 1910 and about 1955. So as you think about the map of not just Minneapolis, but also the Twin Cities and then the state as a whole, think about what communities were growing in that time. And those are the communities that have racial covenants, because it became standard practice, best practice, in those decades to put covenants into place. So you have suburbs that are very different today, like Richfield and Edina, for instance, that are completely blanketed with racial covenants. Mounds View in Ramsey County, Falcon Heights is almost 100% covered with racial covenants. Um, so it's basically, it's suburbs that are really, some suburbs that are super diverse today, and then some suburbs that have been maintained their that are continue to be very white. So we have started to collaborate with different groups across the state of Minnesota to find out where our racial covenants are outside of the metro. We've worked with a group in Rochester. Rochester, Minnesota has a ton of racial covenants. We're currently working with a group in the St. Cloud area to find racial covenants in the three counties that make up sort of the St. Cloud metro area. And we're finding racial covenants in fairly rural areas in St. Cloud. There's an amazing local librarian and historical researcher who's found racial covenants in Cass and Crow Wing counties. And she's found that the cabin country, the area that developed as cabin country in the 1940s, has tons of racial covenants. All these sort of iconic Minnesota resorts are really surrounded by racial covenants. So to me, this just as when we started putting the covenants on the map in the Twin Cities, and we saw that all of our most beloved city parks were encircled by racial covenants. To me, finding that what a lot of Minnesotans think of as like one of the most beautiful parts of Minnesota is that we have these beautiful lakes and we have these places where we can get out in nature and be in resorts with our families, that they are also sort of ringed by racial covenants. It really calls into question how accessible have the amenities that Minnesotans pride themselves on, how really accessible have they been for a wide variety of people. And as someone who loves camping and loves being outdoors, that is really, it's made me really question some of my basic assumptions, I guess, about about the state that I love so much.
Yeah, Cass and Crow Wing County were going to form kind of my next question about what this looks like in rural areas, because I do think there's something to be said about the places where you live, work, and play are kind of represented here. For people who are not
Mm-hmm.
familiar with Minnesota, that it's called kind of the Brainerd Lakes area in the
Mm-hmm.
lake country, if you will, up in
Mm-hmm.
Cass and
Yeah.
Crow Wing County, where a lot of different resorts are up there. So there is this this understanding where you could say that like people from the metro brought this up to, like,
Yes.
that may not actually logistically be how it is, but that is how it could be seen and viewed, whatever. But outside of kind of that resort play country area, are there any other takeaways from more rural areas that are different from what you'd see in urban suburban context?
That's a really open question. We're still trying to figure out, and we're trying to find groups on the ground that want to figure this out for their communities. I mean, I think it's really important to emphasize that Mapping Prejudice, my team will never go anywhere where we're not invited, and we will never just like go into a place and say, "Hey, we're here to tell you about your racial covenants." We always have to be contacted by a group that says, we're really curious about this history. We really want to unearth it and use it to create dialogue and create change. And that those are then we will explore, like, can we work with you and are the records available and that kind of thing. So we have gotten a couple queries from, there's, this person in Cass and Crow Wing County who's done amazing work. This group in St. Cloud, a group in Rochester, but we're really waiting, I guess. So this is call out to your listeners. If there are folks who are really curious to know, what does it look like in Bemidji? What does it look like in Duluth? get in touch, because we think it would be really interesting to have more representative data from across the state of Minnesota, and also people who are on the ground who can sort of compare notes. Like, here's what we're seeing in our community. Here's how we're talking about it with our neighbors. Here's why we think this is important. Because these questions that we've been exploring, not just in the Twin Cities, but across the country, of this housing crisis that we're all facing. I mean, everyone across, and it doesn't matter where you sit on the political spectrum, everyone acknowledges we have a tremendous housing crisis. Um, I think most people acknowledge that we have incredible political polarization. So we're really stuck in, like, how do we move forward? How do we come up with solutions and coalitions that can really break this logjam? And so, I just think we need more voices in the conversation, more participation, more of a sense of agency. So that, that's what we're trying to cultivate with our project, is that you can learn about what's going on in what has happened in your community. You can be a truth teller, and you can be part of the solution.
Yeah, I'm curious to kind of move towards what those solutions look like, because this is one, I guess, issue, if you want to use that term in particular, where kind of an individual level person addressing the problems that we see here may do things for that person and maybe for their sort of immediate circumstances or community, but really change is going to come on a more systemic level, since this
Yeah,
was put in place at a systemic level.
correct.
Is this a thing where you're seeing that, like, leadership in a community is the group that really needs to be involved in helping to create change, or like what sort of getting people on board at that higher level sort of systemic thinking actually is taking place or needs to take place?
Um, Gosh, I think we need it all. So we need, it doesn't, if you have really, like, informed, creative leadership, those people can't do anything if the people who they represent are not on board, right?
Yeah.
So, so that's one thing I hear from people, is who are in positions where they can make change, whether they're, on a local city council or they're on a planning commission. They say, we need people in the community to show up for meetings and speak up, because a lot of times the people who do show up, are really wedded to, I'll just say, like, a lot of these assumptions that led to racial covenants in the first place. This whole idea that our shared prosperity is dependent on racial exclusion. That's at the base, like, what a lot of this is about. And people have lots of different language to express that, today. But I think that's one of the things that's super helpful about, having a longer frame on our current housing crisis, is just figuring out, like, what are the assumptions that are undergirding these systems that we have? What do we need to change if we really want to have structural change? But of course, we can have a groundswell of people who want to make change. But if we have, leaders who are very intransigent and very wedded and very fearful, maybe, about, what does it mean if we change the zoning code in our community to allow, say, multifamily houses, then I think we can get nowhere as well. So we need people to hold their leaders accountable according to their values and their commitments. So I think we need it all, but we need people to have a sense that they can make a difference, right? That informing yourself, and you don't have to just share your opinion on social media, that you can show up and be with your neighbors, and demand, I guess, or try to work towards solutions that express your values. I think people have to remember that that is the only way we are going to move forward. There's going to be no magic wand from on high, from the federal government or from the state government, that's going to fix all this. We all have to be part of the solution. One of my friends and colleagues who works in local government told me that she's incredibly grateful that the state of Minnesota has now appropriated all this money to address the housing crisis on so many different levels. But she said her community will not build housing, will not build a variety of housing. They won't take that money, basically, unless people in the community say that they're in favor of it and stop blocking the construction of new housing, which is what she sees again and again, that people are very fearful of any kind of change. So I think, again, like I think we need this history helps us with reflection and why am I afraid? Where are those fears coming from? What have we learned from the past about past decisions? So, so that's why that's one of the reasons why I think that this work is so important. This narrative storytelling, the mapping, the data, the conversations, hanging out with people like you, having these conversations. That's how we're gonna break out of these sort of very destructive like patterns that we're in right now.
Yeah, and I think that narrative piece is important because so many things we are believing stories,
Yes.
whether they are informed by factual statistical information or not.
Yep.
As we're tell the way that we are shaping our world is through stories that we tell.
Right. As a biblical scholar, I think you know this very well, that stories are very important, right? In the way, yeah, I mean, that's what humans need stories, right? We need narratives to understand how we got to the place that we are today. And yeah, we're in, what's our place in the larger narrative.
Yeah. I think my last question as we come up on our time here is just about we've been pretty Minnesota centric talking about
Hmm.
this conversation, using Minnesota
Yeah.
as an example because this is where your work has been happening a
Yeah.
lot. But I
Yeah.
also saw on the map, the Mapping Prejudice map that you guys have, that Milwaukee's on there now. So it
Yeah.
seems like you've done work outside of the state. Are you getting
Yeah.
interest from outside of the state to do this sort of work? And what does that look like?
Yeah, that's been really amazing. So we now work with, let me see if I can represent all of our partners. We have partner research teams in North Carolina, Washington, D.C., California. Let's see, those are our active projects right now. And I'm going to remember one after we sign off here. Um, but so now what we do is we offer sort of a technical and methodological platform for groups. So it took us a very long time. It took us more than 3 years to figure out how to just get digitized property records and and parse through them so that community members could read these primary sources and then map them. So that was a huge amount of work for us to figure out that process. And actually, before our project started, scholars had been trying to figure out how to do this for 80 years and without success. So when we published our first map, we started getting queries from around the country. People were like, "Hey, can you do this map for us?" And we're like, "No, maybe." And so now what we are doing now is that when people approach us, we explore whether or not we could be in partnership with them, and then we provide sort of a technical infrastructure and technical support and support for community engagement work, and try to we try to we try to make it possible for them to really focus on the community engagement part of the mapping work by handling the technical side of it. So that's a long way of saying there's now dozens of projects like this across the country. We work with some of them. Some of them we just are in conversation with. Some are just popping up independently of us and doing their own thing. But I think everyone shares. I mean, communities across the country, people are really curious to see what's in their deeds. You know what's the base layer of of these sort of racist documents in their city. Like, how does that help them understand what's going on in their city today? So it's just been really, really fun and interesting to see all the different ways that projects across the country have approached this and the maps. So one of the things we're trying to do as a project, or we are doing, we're committed to doing, is we are trying to collect data from all these projects across the country and put it into one big pot here. And not to take it away from those other projects, but to just have sort of a central gathering spot in the hopes that someday someone will be able to make a national map, and we'll be able to sort of see bigger trends, analyze bigger trends, and through that data.
Yeah. I now at this point am sorry to you and the listener that it feels like we just wrapped up, but I'm realizing there's something we didn't talk about that I think is necessary, and that is
Great.
that racial covenants, we are talking about them as though they're in the past. And I think there's an
Mm-hmm.
understanding that these things don't exist anymore in some way. How did it
Okay.
come to end that, or how did it come that racial covenants stopped being created, and why do we still know about them? How do we know that they still exist?
Very important question. Thank you for thank you for covering that. Um, yes. Okay. I'm going to give you a brief legal history here. So, as I said, racial covenants we think were used. Well, we know they were used in the 19th century. They became super popular in the late 19th century, early 20th century. They became they spread like wildfire in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. And increasingly, civil rights activists during those years were saying this is the biggest problem for Black Americans. This is making it impossible for us to find housing, and so the question of covenants became the top priority for the NAACP, which was the leading sort of legal civil rights organization in the 1940s. So they built a legal challenge that they took to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in 1948 that racial covenants were unenforceable. So courts couldn't be used to enforce these racial restrictions. Activists thought, okay, done, right? We're done. But that didn't stop developers because they were unenforceable, but they weren't illegal. And so developers just kept putting them in. And again, they functioned on so many different levels. They weren't just legal documents, they were social signals for people. They were used as sort of bludgeons. They were used to prompt, honestly, like racial violence. So activists went back and started working through other avenues, through state legislatures, and then finally the federal government. So the federal government made racial covenants illegal through the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So they're illegal everywhere across the country in 1968. And then it was like there was this rush in 1968. Okay, we made them illegal. Let's forget about them. But of course, making something illegal doesn't repair the damage that's been done. Like there's still this uneven playing field. And so a lot of times, like this racial language might have come out of a housing code, but all the patterns were already established by 1968. It was very hard for people to catch up in terms of intergenerational wealth. It's very hard to be if a neighborhood has been legally segregated for decades and decades. I mean, it's very hard to undo that. And so that's what we see in the data today is that the patterns that were established by racial covenants are still firmly in place today. And obviously, we still have this 10 to 1 wealth gap, racial wealth gap in the United States, and housing your family's ability to own a house over the previous 100 years really plays into that racial wealth gap. So these are and I could go on and on and on about like all the permutations of that, but that's sort of the very, very high level. So racial covenants, though, sometimes people say, okay, can't we just get rid of them all? And that is not how property records work. But there has been this whole movement for people to do what's called disavowing or discharging racial covenants. So the state of Minnesota actually, after we published our early maps, decided to pass a law to make it possible for anyone who has a racial covenant attached to their home or their property to file another piece of paperwork saying, basically, I renounce I renounce this racial covenant. I renounce the ideas. It doesn't say that on the document, but that's the intent of it. And so thousands of people in Minnesota have done that, have taken that step. It doesn't erase it, but it just sort of, it's an opportunity for people to state their values, I would say. So if you think about your grandchildren, if they're doing research on the house that you lived in, what would you want them to see? So that's one way that people think about it. Minnesota was only the third state in the country to have this kind of law that made it possible to do this. Since Minnesota passed its law, now more than 22 states have passed similar laws. So you see this groundswell, or you did before 2024, this groundswell of people across the country making a decision to do this disavowing or discharging of the racial covenants, which I think for a lot of people has been really empowering and therapeutic.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we were able to get that information in there, because I feel like it's important to understand the entirety of how this is working, how this works, sort of deal. So thank you for sticking around to help clean that up. And
of course,
I would also love to continue talking with you as happens every week. It feels like here, but we'll let you go on and finish your day. But thank you for joining me here. It was I really appreciate the conversation.
Eric, thank you for reaching out, and I really treasure this conversation, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and I hope this is the beginning of a longer dialogue and longer conversation. So thank you for your work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.